He made a quiet, simple request, just one empty seat beside him on the plane. The airline refused without a second thought, but what happened next left every passenger speechless. And when the heartbreaking truth finally came out, even the flight crew couldn't hold back tears. You won't believe what this man was really carrying with him. Stay with me to the end, because this story will change the way you look at the people sitting next to you. And if you love real emotional stories that reveal hidden truths, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because this one will stay with you long after it ends. It was just another ordinary Tuesday morning at Denver International Airport, where the buzz of rolling suitcases, boarding calls, and clinking coffee cups filled the air like a familiar background song, barely noticed by the regular travelers hustling to catch flights or return home. The terminal was alive with movement, people half awake but functioning, glued to their phones or dragging along sleepy children, barely glancing at those around them. Among the sea of faces was a man who didn't stand out in the slightest, a middle-aged traveler named Daniel Moore, dressed in a faded navy hoodie, comfortable sneakers, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. To the casual observer, he looked like any other tired businessman or quiet loner making his way to the next city. He carried a small backpack slung over one shoulder, no flashy luggage, no sense of urgency, just a calm and quiet demeanor that suggested someone used to traveling alone. But Daniel wasn't like the others. Not today. Beneath the layers of worn fabric and the slight slump of his shoulders was a man carrying more than just clothes or personal items. He carried something invisible but heavy, something that couldn't be tucked into overhead storage or weighed at a baggage counter. When he reached the check-in desk for Sunrise Airlines, he waited patiently in line, watching others argue over seating preferences, bag fees, and delays. When it was finally his turn, he stepped forward with a soft voice and gentle eyes, looking at the agent behind the counter, and simply said, "If it's possible, could I please have an empty seat next to me?" He didn't ask for an upgrade. He didn't mention a medical condition. His voice was polite, his request simple, even a bit hopeful. The woman behind the counter, flustered and clearly juggling too many tasks, barely looked at him. "I'm sorry, sir," she said flatly, typing something quickly. "The flight is full." Daniel didn't protest. He didn't ask to speak to a supervisor or argue for special treatment. He just smiled slightly, nodded, and said, "Thank you anyway," before quietly stepping aside. What no one around him realized in that moment, what no one could have known, was that this seemingly unimportant denial would become the thread that unraveled a much bigger, deeply human story. As Daniel made his way to the security line, other passengers cut in front of one another, some complaining loudly about delays, some arguing with TSA agents, and yet Daniel moved slowly, silently, as though each step took extra effort. He clutched his backpack a little tighter as he removed his shoes and belt like everyone else, but there was something different in the way he handled his belongings, more careful, more deliberate. He kept checking the contents of his backpack, not with the anxiety of someone carrying something suspicious, but with the tenderness of someone protecting something sacred. The security agents didn't notice. The passengers didn't care. And Daniel passed through without issue. After making his way through the terminal, he arrived at gate B27 and found a quiet seat near the corner, away from the charging stations and noisy families. He pulled out a small photo from his bag, a worn snapshot of two men in military uniforms, standing shoulder to shoulder, beaming with pride. Daniel stared at the picture for a long time, running his thumb gently across the younger man's face, as though the motion could bring him back. Then, as if sensing someone might be watching, he tucked it away and closed his eyes for a moment. The boarding announcement came, and people began crowding the gate as if the plane might leave without them. Daniel waited until nearly the last group was called before rising from his seat and making his way slowly toward the jet bridge. The agent scanned his ticket with barely a glance, and he stepped aboard the aircraft, walking down the narrow aisle until he found his seat, 18A, by the window. The middle and aisle seats were still unoccupied, and for a fleeting moment Daniel let himself believe, just maybe, that the seat beside him would remain empty. But as boarding continued, it became clear that hope was short-lived. A woman, in her 30s, stopped beside him and offered a tight smile, before placing her bag overhead and sliding into the middle seat. She seemed polite but distracted, and like most passengers, didn't engage much with the person beside her. Daniel greeted her with a small nod and returned to gazing out the window. The plane filled, the flight attendants went through the safety instructions, and soon they were airborne. For the first hour, neither Daniel nor the woman beside him spoke. She scrolled through her phone, answered a few work emails, then eventually pulled out a book. But something about Daniel's stillness began to catch her attention. He didn't eat. He didn't watch anything. He barely moved, except to occasionally reach into his backpack and grip it protectively on his lap. She glanced at him again, and noticed how his eyes never really focused on anything outside. They were just lost in thought. Something about his presence felt deeply heavy, though not in a way that disturbed her, more like someone silently grieving. Eventually, she spoke softly. "Excuse me, are you all right?" Daniel looked at her and gave a small, polite smile. "I'm okay, just a long day ahead." She nodded, but the concern lingered in her expression. A few minutes passed, and then, unexpectedly, a small photo slipped out from the side pocket of his backpack and landed on the floor. She reached down and picked it up, holding it just long enough to see the image, Daniel in uniform, beside the same younger man from before. She handed it back, hesitating. "Your son?" she asked. Daniel's lips trembled as he answered, "Yes, Kyle. He was 22. The woman's face softened instantly. "Was?" she repeated gently. Daniel took a deep breath and nodded, his voice nearly a whisper. "He was killed in action. Last month. Today would have been his birthday." The air between them shifted. The casual, quiet indifference of the plane cabin gave way to a silence that felt reverent. Daniel continued, his voice stronger now. "We used to travel every year on his birthday, a tradition even when he was deployed. Last year he flew home to surprise me. This year I'm flying alone, to scatter his ashes at his favorite beach in Boston." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Behind them, another passenger had overheard and quietly passed the story forward. One by one, rows of people began to whisper, the mood subtly changing from the usual in-flight routine to something more tender, more aware. A man in first class got up and quietly asked the crew if he could give Daniel his seat. The flight attendant, moved by what she had heard, offered Daniel a private row in the back that had just become available due to a last-minute cancellation. The crew discreetly informed the captain, who made a heartfelt announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we have the honor of carrying Gold Star Father Daniel Moore, traveling in memory of his son, Army Specialist Kyle Moore, who gave his life in service to this country. We invite you to join us in a moment of silence." The cabin fell into a stillness unlike anything experienced on a commercial flight. No rustling, no beeping, just a shared collective breath of mourning and respect. Passengers, once strangers, became united in that moment, eyes moist, hearts heavy. Flight attendants brought Daniel snacks, drinks, and even a handwritten card signed by fellow passengers. When the plane landed, people waited, not rushing off as usual. The crew and captain met Daniel at the gate and shook his hand. Several passengers patted his shoulder in passing, and when Daniel finally arrived at the shore later that day, standing quietly with his son's ashes in hand, he wasn't alone. 3 people from the flight had found him through social media and showed up quietly, standing at a respectful distance, holding flowers. What had started as a denied request for a little space ended up revealing the depth of a father's loss, the quiet strength of his journey, and the incredible humanity still alive in people when given a chance to respond. And all of it began because someone said no, and the world unexpectedly answered yes. Daniel boarded the plane quietly, near the end of the line like he always did. Not because he was in a rush or wanted to avoid attention, but because it gave him a moment to observe, to collect himself, to delay the part of the journey he was dreading most. He moved down the narrow aisle with slow, deliberate steps, clutching a small black backpack to his chest like it was something sacred. To anyone else, he probably looked like a regular traveler. Maybe a little tired, maybe traveling, alone but otherwise unremarkable. His seat was 18A, a window seat near the rear of the aircraft, and he slipped into it quietly, pressing his body as close to the window as possible, as though he wanted to disappear into the side of the plane. He set the backpack on his lap and rested both hands on it, holding it more like one would hold a fragile box or a piece of glass than a travel bag. The overhead compartments clicked shut, passengers settled in, and the usual buzz of pre-flight activity hummed all around him. He didn't participate. He didn't make eye contact. He just stared out the window, not at anything in particular, just away. It wasn't long before a woman appeared beside him, a 30-something professional-looking traveler with earbuds already in and a leather laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She sighed audibly as she maneuvered into the middle seat, muttering something about tight spaces before settling in. She gave Daniel the briefest glance, a polite smile at most, and then turned her attention back to her phone. He didn't respond, not out of rudeness, but because he seemed to be somewhere else, entirely. The flight attendants did their safety demonstration, the doors closed, and the engines roared to life with their usual shuddering force, pushing the aircraft toward the runway. As the plane lifted off the ground, tilting slightly and climbing into the sky, the passengers shifted in their seats, some yawning, others closing their eyes or diving into movies. But Daniel remained completely still, his gaze fixed on the clouds outside as if searching for something among them. He didn't react to the ascent. He didn't flinch during turbulence. He didn't fumble with the tray table or fidget with the seatbelt like so many others. The woman beside him, now midway through a podcast and sipping ginger ale, occasionally glanced sideways at him. She started to notice things. He hadn't touched the snack handed out earlier. He hadn't plugged in headphones. He hadn't spoken a single word since boarding. And more importantly, he hadn't moved his hands from that backpack, which now sat firmly in his lap like a silent passenger of its own. His stillness wasn't like someone who was sleeping or relaxed. It was the kind of stillness that felt like armor, like he was holding something in. The kind of stillness that suggested the moment he moved or spoke, everything might break. Her curiosity began to bubble, though she tried not to stare. Every now and then, she peeked over at him, from the corner of her eye. He didn't cry, he didn't sigh. But there was something in the way his shoulders curled inward, the way his eyes blinked slowly, and the way his mouth held this tight, almost trembling line that hinted at something deeper. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She pulled out one of her earbuds and, without fully turning toward him, spoke softly. "Excuse me, are you okay?" she asked, voice careful, almost afraid to disrupt whatever silence he was clinging to. Daniel turned to her slowly, as if coming back from somewhere far away, and managed a faint, hollow smile. "I'm all right," he said, his voice low and almost too calm. "Just a long day ahead." His words hung in the air like something unfinished, like there was so much more to say but no energy to say it. The woman nodded, unsure how to respond. She didn't want to intrude, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't all right at all. She turned back to her screen, but her focus was gone. Something about him unsettled her, not in a fearful way, but in a way that made her feel like she was sitting beside a man on the edge of something important, the kind of man whose silence meant more than words. Behind them, passengers laughed at movie scenes, flipped through magazines, and chatted about weekend plans. But beside her sat a man who hadn't smiled once, hadn't checked his phone, hadn't even blinked much. It was then she noticed a small object peeking out from the side pocket of his backpack, a folded corner of a photograph. She only glimpsed it for a second, but it looked like a military uniform. She didn't ask. Not yet. But her mind raced, with questions. Was he a veteran? Was he mourning someone? Was that why he wanted the seat beside him empty? She remembered the way he'd been holding the bag, the way he'd made himself small, silent, the way he didn't react to anything like the rest of them did. Something was different. Something was coming. She could feel it in the air. And while no one else seemed to notice him, just a quiet man in a hoodie staring out the window, she began to realize that there was more to this flight than she expected. Something was quietly unfolding at 30,000 feet, and it all seemed to be centered on the man beside her, whose story hadn't even begun to be told. An hour into the flight, just as the cabin began to settle into that strange mid-air stillness, When the initial buzz of takeoff fades, the food trays have come and gone, and most people are quietly drifting into their own routines. A small disruption happened that would unravel everything Daniel had kept tucked inside. A child across the aisle, maybe 4 or 5 years old, giggled while playing with a toy airplane, then accidentally let it slip from his hands. It rolled beneath the seats and came to rest near Daniel's feet. Without thinking, Daniel bent down to pick it up, carefully maneuvering between cramped legs and seat frames, and as he did, the motion jostled his backpack just enough for a small photograph to slide from the unzipped side pocket and float gently to the floor. Before Daniel could react, the woman sitting beside him noticed it. She reached down quickly, retrieving the photo with the intention of simply handing it back. But the moment her eyes fell on the image, her fingers paused ever so slightly. It was a picture of Daniel, unmistakably younger but still recognizable in full military uniform. He was standing proudly beside a young man with similar features, a warm smile on both their faces, the kind of smile born not just from joy but from love, deep and familial. She looked at Daniel, her voice tentative and soft. "Your son?" she asked. Daniel met her eyes, and for the first time since the flight began, he didn't smile. He didn't deflect. He just nodded once, slowly. Yes, Kyle. He was 22. It was the word "was" that hit the woman like a punch to the chest. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "Was?" she repeated, her voice now a whisper. Daniel turned his face back toward the window, but his words came out clear enough to shatter the growing silence around them. "Killed in action. Last month. Today. Today would have been his birthday." Suddenly, the ambient noise of the plane, the hum of engines, the clatter of drink carts, the distant chatter, seemed to dim, as if the aircraft itself recognized the weight of those words. The woman beside him swallowed hard. She didn't know what to say. Neither did the older man in the aisle seat, who had overheard, or the young couple in the row ahead, who had caught pieces of the conversation. Without realizing it, a sort of invisible hush rippled outward from seat 18A, traveling quietly through the cabin like a wave of empathy. Daniel didn't elaborate further, not yet. He kept his gaze on the sky beyond the glass, but his voice, when it did return, was thick with memory. "We used to travel every year on his birthday," he said. "Just the two of us. Father-son tradition. Even after he enlisted, we promised we'd keep it going. Last year, he flew home from his base and surprised me. We drove up the coast and spent the whole day at Crane Beach, his favorite place in the world." He paused, his voice catching. "This year, I'm flying alone to scatter his ashes. Same beach, same date. Because a promise is a promise." The woman's hand almost instinctively moved to gently rest on Daniel's wrist. She didn't squeeze it. She didn't speak. She just anchored him for a moment, as if to let him know he wasn't as alone as he felt. Meanwhile, around them, passengers who had been mid-movie or mid-conversation had now turned subtly toward the scene, ears tuning in, hearts softening. They didn't mean to intrude, but the truth was, Daniel's pain had become a quiet gravity, drawing everyone closer, without words. In row 17, a man who had earlier grumbled about legroom now sat with his hands folded, his eyes locked forward in respectful silence. The child's mother, the one whose son had dropped the toy, reached across the aisle and gently touched Daniel's shoulder. "I'm so sorry," she said. Simple words, but they landed with sincerity. And then, no one really remembers who, it happened. Someone rang the flight attendant call button. A light blinked above. A moment later, a young flight attendant appeared, her expression shifting quickly when she saw the woman in 18B quietly wiping her eyes. The woman leaned over, whispered something into the attendant's ear, and the attendant nodded slowly. She disappeared toward the galley. Minutes passed and Daniel resumed staring out the window, unaware of what was quietly being set into motion behind the scenes. In the back of the plane, the flight attendants huddled. The purser spoke with the captain. A decision was made. It wasn't policy, it wasn't protocol, but it was right. Moments later, the flight attendant returned with something folded in her hands. She approached Daniel and gently knelt beside his seat. "Mr. Moore," she said softly. He turned, surprised. "We just want you to know," she continued. "We're honored to have you with us today, and we're sorry for your loss." She unfolded a small American flag pin and handed it to him, her hands shaking slightly. "The crew would like to dedicate the remainder of this flight in memory of your son, Kyle." Daniel looked stunned, frozen for a second. The woman beside him was now openly emotional. The passengers around him all sat in reverent silence, some with heads bowed, others with hands clasped. It wasn't planned, it wasn't on the schedule, but somehow that flight became something different, something sacred. In that pressurized tube flying through the sky, time seemed to hold its breath. One man's pain had become a shared burden, a reminder of sacrifice, of love, of the invisible stories sitting quietly among us. Daniel nodded slowly, a tear finally slipping down his cheek. He didn't try to wipe it away. He just held the pin close and whispered, almost to himself, "Thank you." And as the plane continued its journey east, bound for Boston, everyone on board sat a little straighter, breathed a little deeper, and for the rest of that flight, no one saw Daniel Moore as just another quiet traveler. They saw a father, a soldier, a man carrying the weight of a promise across the sky, bound for the sea, and a goodbye no one would ever forget. Within minutes, whispers spread down the cabin like wildfire. People leaned over seats to tell others, soft murmurs rippling through rows like a current. What had begun as a quiet moment now became a collective awakening. Something about the gravity of Daniel's story pulled people from their own little bubbles of movies, headphones, and half-finished crossword puzzles into a larger, shared experience. And then, in a series of spontaneous acts that no airline manual could have predicted, something extraordinary began to happen. A man from first class, tall, graying at the temples, walked the aisle purposefully and spoke to a flight attendant. Moments later, he returned with a nod, gently tapped Daniel's shoulder and offered him his seat. "You deserve comfort today more than I do," he said. Daniel hesitated, stunned by the offer, but the man smiled and simply insisted, "Please, for Kyle." Just then, another attendant came forward with news. A last-minute cancellation had left an entire row at the back of the plane unoccupied. Would Daniel prefer the privacy? Slowly, gently, they helped him relocate. As Daniel settled into the new seat, holding the photo of his son a little tighter, the plane's captain made an announcement. His voice, calm but clearly emotional, broke through the cabin speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this is your captain speaking. Today, we have the distinct honor of carrying a Gold Star father on board, Mr. Daniel Moore. He is traveling in memory of his son, Army Specialist Kyle Moore, who made the ultimate sacrifice for our country. In recognition of his service and the promise between father and son, we now invite you to join us in a moment of silence." And just like that, a hush swept through the entire aircraft. Not a cough, not a cry, not a single sound broke the stillness. Even the children, sensing something sacred, stilled. The engines hummed beneath them, but otherwise the plane seemed suspended in reverent quiet, cruising through the clouds not just with passengers, but with a purpose. In that moment, 200 strangers shared something that had no name, a bond of respect, of gratitude, of sorrow and solidarity. Daniel, now seated alone near the back, clutched the photo of Kyle in one hand and the folded flag pin in the other. His face was wet with silent tears, but for the first time in weeks he didn't feel alone in his grief. The silence ended, but the mood didn't fade. One by one, passengers approached. A mother handed him a note written in crayon from her son. "Thank you for being brave like my daddy." A young man in uniform stepped forward, saluted, and said, "Nothing." An elderly woman touched his shoulder and whispered, "We see you." Flight attendants came by with coffee, a small fruit plate, and a folded napkin with a handwritten card, signed by passengers in rows 10 through 24. "We're with you today, Mr. Moore," it read. "Kyle's memory flies with us." People didn't look at him the same anymore. They saw not just a quiet man in a hoodie, but a father traveling with grief as his co-pilot, a man who carried a story that now belonged to all of them. The woman from earlier, now seated across the aisle, caught his eye and smiled through tears. It wasn't pity. It was respect. Around them, passengers returned to their seats, but not to their distractions. Instead, many looked out the windows, thoughtful and still, holding on to the feeling they didn't want to lose. And through it all, Daniel remained seated, the photo resting on his tray table, as if Kyle too was watching the world from 35,000 feet, a final flight not in uniform, but in memory, surrounded by strangers who had become a temporary silent family in the sky. Within minutes, the news that Daniel Moore was on board, a Gold Star father traveling in memory of his son, Army Specialist Kyle Moore, spread through the cabin like wildfire, carried on whispers that fluttered from one row to the next until everyone knew. It started quietly, a simple exchange between strangers who felt the weight of a story much bigger than themselves. And then, unexpectedly, the atmosphere on the plane began to shift in a way the airline could never have anticipated or prepared for. In first class, a man who had been sitting comfortably suddenly stood up and asked a flight attendant if he could give up his seat so Daniel could have more space, wanting to show respect in a small but deeply meaningful way. Moments later, a flight attendant returned with an offer no one could have foreseen. A whole row near the back of the plane had just opened up due to a last-minute cancellation, and it was being offered to Daniel, so he could have room to breathe, to sit without being crowded, to have a place where he could feel a semblance of peace during this journey. Then the captain, who had been quietly informed mid-flight, took the microphone and addressed the cabin with a voice that held both pride and sorrow, making an announcement that immediately drew tears from half the passengers, young and old, alike. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have the honor of carrying a Gold Star father on board, Daniel Moore, who is traveling in memory of his son, Army Specialist Kyle Moore, who made the ultimate sacrifice in service to our country. We invite you to join us in a moment of silence in his honor. The cabin transformed instantly. The usual hum of conversations and the rustling of pages and electronic devices faded into an unbroken silence so profound it was almost tangible, a silence that held more emotion than any words ever could, as 200 strangers became a collective witness to grief and honor. Not a cough, not a sniffle, not a breath out of place. Just silence. A shared space where sorrow and respect intertwined, where the invisible threads of empathy pulled at every heart on that plane, uniting them all in a moment none would soon forget. Daniel moved beyond words, sat in his newly assigned seat near the back of the plane, staring down at a worn photograph of his son, clutching it gently as though it might somehow keep Kyle close despite the miles and the years between them. Around him, flight attendants approached with quiet kindness, bringing coffee and snacks without a word, but with eyes that said, "We see you. We honor you." One handed him a small folded card, covered in signatures and handwritten messages from passengers who had taken the time to write their gratitude and sympathy, their words like lifelines reaching across the rows to a man who had sacrificed so much. Some passengers wiped tears from their eyes. Others simply nodded in silent respect, their expressions changed forever by the simple, powerful reminder of sacrifice and humanity that Daniel's presence brought to their routine journey. No one looked at Daniel the same anymore. Not as just another traveler, not as a stranger, but as someone who carried a profound story in his heart, someone who had faced unimaginable loss and still chose to carry on, who reminded everyone on that flight that courage and kindness often show up in the quietest, most unexpected places. The atmosphere on the plane, once filled with the usual distractions and impatience, had been transformed into something sacred, a moment suspended in time where compassion reigned and the invisible bonds of shared humanity became undeniable. Passengers exchanged glances that spoke volumes, their own personal struggles momentarily softened by the weight of the moment, each person quietly acknowledging the profound impact of witnessing a father's love and loss. As the plane continued its journey across the sky, Daniel sat with the photo of his son resting in his hands, tears streaming quietly down his cheeks, but a soft, grateful smile breaking through his pain, knowing that on this flight, among these strangers who had become companions in sorrow and respect, the memory of Kyle was alive and honored. And in that collective silence, healing had begun in a way that no one aboard would ever forget. When the plane finally touched down in Boston and passengers began gathering their belongings, a quiet calm hung in the air. Not the usual scramble of shuffling feet and clattering overhead bins, but a respectful hush as if the gravity of one man's story had somehow anchored everyone in place. Daniel remained seated until the very end, not because he was slow, but because he needed a moment to gather himself. When he finally stood, clutching his backpack and that precious photograph of his son, he was met at the door not by silence but by reverence. The captain, who had made the mid-air announcement, stood tall with a solemn expression, extended his hand and said, "Thank you for your family's sacrifice." Daniel accepted it, nodding humbly. The crew, lined up along the jet bridge, saluted him as he walked by, not as a celebrity or VIP, but as a father who had given the world something no words could fully repay. Passengers slowed their pace behind him. Some placed gentle hands on his shoulder. A few quietly said, "Thank you," while others just looked at him with wet eyes and silent understanding. No one pushed past him. No one seemed in a hurry anymore. For once, an airport terminal was not a blur of selfish rush, but a space suspended in shared respect. Later that afternoon, Daniel made his way to the coast, to a quiet beach just beyond the edge of the city, the place his son had always called his peace. The sky hung heavy with a blanket of clouds, and the waves crashed in a rhythm that felt like the heartbeat of the earth itself. He stood at the shoreline holding a small wooden box, the final physical weight of the son he'd raised, laughed with, worried over, and now mourned. The wind tugged at his coat as if urging him forward, and as he stepped closer to the sea, ready to release Kyle into the embrace of the ocean he had loved, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting to see a curious passerby or maybe a local jogger, but what he saw instead stopped him in his tracks. Dozens of the passengers, from the flight, faces he vaguely recognized from the rows behind and ahead of him, now stepping onto the beach. Some held flowers, others carried small candles. A few brought their children, whispering gently to them to be respectful. Somehow, through word of mouth and social media, they had found him. They came not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. An instinct to stand beside someone who had suffered, someone who reminded them that behind every face in an airport terminal, or in a seat beside you, there might be a story that could shift your entire worldview. They formed a semicircle as Daniel walked to the water's edge. No one said a word. The only sound was the crash of the surf and the low sob of wind across the dunes. Daniel knelt, opened the box, and released the ashes into the breeze. They scattered like whispers, like prayers. He whispered something too, but no one needed to hear the words to feel their meaning. When he stood again, eyes glassy, he was not alone. He was surrounded by the unlikeliest of companions, strangers, turned witnesses to a sacred moment. They embraced. They shared stories of their own losses. One woman told Daniel about her brother, also a soldier. A man described losing his father to illness just months before. A child gave Daniel a seashell and said, "You can keep this too. Remember." And somehow, amidst grief, there was healing. What had begun with a cold denial at a check-in counter had bloomed into a moment of raw human connection. Daniel never expected kindness from strangers. He didn't want pity. All he had asked for was an empty seat, space to breathe, to remember, to grieve. But what he received instead was a reminder that even in a fast, noisy, disconnected world, compassion can still ripple through a crowd like a wave through the sea. On that beach, surrounded by people he'd never known before the day began, Daniel saw that his son's legacy wasn't just in the uniform he wore or the medals he earned. It was in the hearts he touched through his father's quiet mourning. And maybe, just maybe, the real story wasn't about the flight or even the destination, but about the space created in the middle, where strangers saw someone else's pain and decided to make room. It's easy to forget, in the hustle of gates and security lines, that every person is carrying something: loss, love, hope, regret. But Daniel's journey reminded them all that it takes only a moment of awareness to shift from bystander to ally. And for those watching this story unfold, whether in the air, on the beach, or right now through this screen, perhaps it's a Call to slow down, look around, and remember, behind every quiet traveler is a story that might break your heart, and maybe if you let it, help heal yours too. And sometimes, it's not the loudest moments that stay with us. It's the quiet ones. A denied request, a fallen photo, a silent row of strangers transformed by one man's grief. Daniel Moore didn't ask for sympathy. He only wanted a seat beside him to stay empty. But what he received instead was a plane full of hearts that were unexpectedly filled. This story reminds us that behind every face at the airport, in the crowd, or even in the seat next to you, there may be a silent battle, a story you'll never guess, unless you take a moment to look. In a world that moves too fast, sometimes it takes one pause, one act of compassion, to remind us of our shared humanity. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it reminded you of someone you've loved and lost, don't let it stop here. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because on this channel, we share real, powerful stories that deserve to be heard. Leave a comment with your thoughts, or share a story of your own. You never know who might need to hear it. Thanks for watching, and remember, the seat beside you may be empty, but someone's heart never is.